Okay, we are live. I am here with Nate Fischler. He is one of our newest Asia Pacific analysts, and we are going to talk a little bit about various reactions that our various regions have had to financial upheaval. We're going to talk specifically about financial related unrest or economic and financial related unrest in Lebanon, in my case, and then China in Nate's case. We're going to talk about how the states have responded and just kind of compare and contrast the two different situations. So I guess I'll start with Nate. Why don't you tell us what's been going on in China?
Yeah, sure. This was a few months back already, but in mid-July there were some protests in Zhengzhou, Henan, which is central China, a little bit of a more isolated part of China, so not the East Coast, not the big cities, not Beijing or Shanghai that we hear about more often. These are protests against some rural banks who had some bad investments in real estate. It's tied into that whole real estate debacle that's happening in China right now. Bunch of depositors, over 1,000, attempted to withdraw funds from the bank. It had no liquidity, and they were not able to withdraw funds. So they protested, and then these protests were violently dispersed by either plainclothes officers or maybe even hired thugs. And that's just the sort of baseline situation that happened there a couple months ago. And we can talk more about the implications. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what's happening in Lebanon, Charles?
Sure, sure. In Lebanon, we've had this is over the past month. We've had a series of they are essentially armed holdups of banks by angry depositors. Essentially, Lebanon no longer has enough foreign currency to ensure everyone's deposits, and so individuals are holding up banks to get their money out of the bank. They're forcibly trying to withdraw their money from various Lebanese, and these are private banks, and it's a countrywide problem vis-a-vis private banks. They've been low on cash for over a year now, and they've severely limited deposits in the absence of government activity to try and meet or remediate the situation. They've been forced to curtail deposits, and a lot of Lebanese have their savings in dollars or in foreign currency. So people want to try and get it out in the same foreign currency they got it in at, and the foreign currency just isn't there. So they're resorting to armed holdups. Last week there were seven armed holdups in total. One high-profile one in Beirut that caught a lot of people's attention. Um, and these so far they've been fairly successful, and they're gaining a level of popularity as kind of a Robin Hood because everybody's mad at the banks is essentially the situation. It's gotten so bad that banks are closed indefinitely across Lebanon. The Association of Banking, the Banking Association declared an indefinite closure until the security situation is improved. So, and that's kind of where things are at right now. Um,
This sounds a lot worse, relatively speaking, than the situation in China, where there was just one
yeah.
sort of isolated protest that was put down quickly. The authorities tend to move quickly in China,
Mhm.
they do not like too much civil unrest, and they try to clamp down on it as quickly as possible. So I'm wondering, Charlie, what are the authorities doing in Lebanon to try to quell the situation?
Well, so I mean, right now they're kind of up a so to speak up a creek in terms of what they can try and do. They've tried arresting people, but there's such popular backlash against the arrest that the people usually end up um, getting out in a matter of days, if not hours. Um, in other situations, they've in an earlier situation in August, they used a they there was a case where a depositor took hostages, and they used a long-term negotiation strategy to get him out. He was in the bank for 6 hours, I think. He still got his money, and he was arrested, and then they later released him. He's again one of those Robin Hood type figures. So they're trying to work with the banks. The Lebanese interior minister met with banking officials earlier this week, and unfortunately, he confided in them that Lebanese security forces do not have the resources to secure every single bank or to provide security for every single private bank in the country. So, and that was when the banking association decided to extend its strike. It was originally a 3-day closure to figure things out, and then they said, well, the government's not going to secure us, so we're going to keep our doors closed indefinitely until either until we come up with a solution. So that's kind of where the situation is at right now. You've had the pressure group called the Depositors Outcry spring up, and they've kind of taken an active role in encouraging these kinds of incidents. The evidence is kind of sketchy as to if they're planning in them, but certainly activists from the group have participated in at least one of these holdups. So there is some cohesion coming along there. And in China, how did the government? You mentioned a fairly strong crackdown. Um, did they also insure people's deposits, or how did they deal with the demand side of the equation?
Sure. Well, those are two separate things. Let me take them one at a time. The response. So the Chinese government has to play a little bit of a balancing act. They don't want to be seen to have a repeat of the Tiananmen 1989 debacle. So what they relied on instead we're not exactly sure. It's either plainclothes police officers or even hired thugs to disperse the protesters. So we're not seeing uniformed army or police take care of them, but we're pretty confident that it was a command from the authorities to do so. But as far as the depositors getting their money back, so that slowly came into play over the subsequent weeks and months. I think funds are still being dispersed, but there is a sort of hierarchy. So the less money you have, the more likely you're able to get it out earlier. And as sort of liquidity was restored to this branch of the People's Bank of China, which again is sort of rural, then people will quietly be able to get their funds back after the dust has already settled on this protest. And I'll make one other point that this is typical in China when we have social unrest is they will petition their local or their provincial government to then do something and petition the capital Beijing to do something on their behalf. So this is what the protesters were hoping for. And as far as holding anybody accountable, to my knowledge, the only thing that's happened is some of the bank officials in Zhengzhou have been suspended or investigated, and there's really not much on that front.
Yeah, in Lebanon, there really is a lack of accountability, and this is across the board. Whether it's in the banking sector, there's both a lack of accountability as well as a lack of transparency that really makes these situations a lot more difficult than in China. Not that there isn't the opacity in China, obviously there is, but there's more of a shared frame of reference for that opacity, and everybody accepts that opacity in China. I think that maybe they don't in Lebanon. They don't in Lebanon. Lebanon, they fashion themselves as a democratic country, and you know, so there's more of a willingness to certainly allow free speech and those kinds of things, but also there's a reticence to go after individual citizens because of the fact that citizens have more power at the individual and group level to make things difficult for security forces in the event of someone high profile gets arrested. There's also a sectarian dimension, which we can talk about a little bit.
Yeah, I was going to bring that up. So in China, of course, you have one party. They have monopolistic authority over pretty much all sectors of society. But this is a very different sort of environment, political and authority related environment than we have in Lebanon, where the sectarian mosaic, if you will, complicates the picture. So maybe you could discuss that a little bit.
Oh, certainly it does, and that's true. The sectarian dimension permeates every sector in Lebanon, including the banking sector. And people have, well, maybe not in general, but there is a distribution of power among sectarian leaders, and that distribution of power is, I believe, it's essentially written into the Lebanese constitution. Although I'll have to look that up. The Lebanese president has to be Maronite Catholic. The the prime minister has to be Sunni Muslim and the speaker of parliament has to be Shia. So that dynamic is written in and kind of fixed. So as an just as an example, so there isn't a state power that is able to kind of oversee everything in the way that China has, one party rule kind of system. In terms of the banks, there is a possibility down the road, and this is particularly concerning given the security forces' lack of capability, that the banks may turn to their sectarian militia of choice to provide security for the banks as opposed to trying to rely on the security forces. And that is certainly a major concern.
As this situation sort of unfolds, how likely do you think that is, that people will turn to their de facto sectarian militia groups for the protection that the state cannot afford them?
I think it's fairly likely in the situation, especially when we're talking about the banks like this. If the security forces can't secure every bank, then militias will have to step in to either on an individual level or either send individual members to secure the banks, or and that presents two problems. One, there is a possibility of violence in the event of further robberies. The militias fire at a robbery suspect, and God forbid someone gets killed, then that could inflame sectarian tensions. Or the mere presence of having different armed factions in close proximity to one another would also create the possibility for incidents on its own, even if further robberies don't occur. So there's that dimension as well. And I'm going to say one other thing, and that is, even theoretically, if the security forces could provide security at all the banks, there are other security issues in Lebanon that are there that they also have to address and have to be taken care of. So political protests are fairly common. Terrorism is still a concern. Other militancy is still a concern that the Lebanese state has to deal with. So you've got those multiple overlapping security issues that the Lebanese state has to deal with that I'm guessing the Chinese government does not to the same degree.
Yeah, these are two very different environments, security environments. The Communist Party, as we've seen from how they handled these similar types of protests in their country, really do have a handle on things, and you are not likely to get away with protesting in the same way that you can in Lebanon. It's really not that common. I mean, it does happen, but when it happens, the authorities are very quick to react, and they don't have this problem of institutionalized sectarianism. So you have very contrasting pictures here of about as solid a one-party system as you can possibly think of, and then on the other side you have a very divisive, or a divided rather, picture.
Yep. And China, you also have a much more competent in general governing authority that can, that has different levers and different tools to use and knows when to use which tools. In
Absolutely.
Lebanon, you have a fairly uh, a fairly diverse group of actors running the show, and they can't necessarily agree on what the best tool is. Whereas in China, you have a consensus, even if it's in the consensus of one person. To what extent are these security decisions made by one? If to what extent are these security decisions made by one person, and to what extent are they made as a consensus matter?
Oh, it's definitely top down. I mean,
Okay.
you have Xi Jinping at the top. Obviously, I don't think, or I don't have any indication that he was calling the shots on this particular incident. But whoever it was, it's somebody high up in the hierarchy, either in the Zhengzhou municipal, Henan province, or Beijing capital. Security architecture. So whoever, you have somebody making decisions. It's very chain of command oriented, and it just goes from the top down, and orders
Yeah.
are followed. And I'll also add that technology plays a big part in this. So
Yep.
during
Yep.
these protests, you had social media blocked, you had group chats that were discussing it blocked. So the authorities took, all the tools at their disposal to get people not only to not protest, but to get them to stop talking about it, which, again, they're very effective at these things.
Yeah, and I will say in Lebanon there is an increasing use of technology in the past. Oh, I would say 4 or 5 years. There's been reporting that Lebanon has beefed up its cyber capabilities in terms of, but they're mostly putting them towards more foreign espionage and more traditional use cases rather than domestic dissent suppression. So, and they obviously lag way behind China in terms of the sort of, I get the impression anyway, at least in terms of the pervasiveness of censorship and of cyber um, capabilities.
Certainly.
Um, so, um, well, this has been a fascinating discussion, and if you, I think this is probably a good time to end it. If you'd like to learn more about us, please subscribe to RANE Network, and there's a lot more articles to read on both my topic and on Nate's topic. We will certainly cover these issues of the interplay between financial and economic hardship and political unrest. So, um,
All right. Thank you, everybody. Catch you next time.